Hello and welcome to This Week in Cleantech, the weekly podcast that reviews and shares the biggest or most interesting cleantech news stories of the week. The podcast is now live on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher and SoundCloud. It would be much appreciated if you could subscribe on iTunes and write a review to support us. I'm your host, David Hunt, and each week I'll be joined by a guest from the sector to offer their insights and experience. This week, I'm joined by CEO of Pivot Power, Matt Allen. If you're in the clean tech sector, you'd be hard pushed not to have seen the exciting news and development at Pivot Power in the last few months. Pivot Power are developing, funding and operating large-scale battery storage projects connected directly to the transmission system, providing, amongst other services, EV charging infrastructure. I'll ask Matt to share some more about those developments later in the show, but first to delve into some of the big news stories of the week. Matt, I'm sure the suspension of the capacity market in the UK must have caught your eye, instigated by an appeal at the European Court of Justice by a former colleague of yours, actually Sarah Bell of Tempest Energy. Certainly from my thoughts, initially it could be seen as beneficial to renewable generators and storage if it's a harder hit for some of the incumbent traditional energy players in the capacity market. What were your initial thoughts?
Thank you very much, David, for having me, and great to be the industry by surprise. Even my colleague Mike and myself, who, as you mentioned, worked with Sarah a few years back, and I think it validated, to be totally honest, some of the views that we had on the market. Partially, we need to have resilient business models that. How many times I pivot conversation over the course of the next 15 years, and locking in that revenue stream, which from an investment standpoint, quite attractive on the end. But the reality is that potentially does lock in and lose some of that pivotability over time. But all that said, it was always going to be a relatively small percentage of the overall step. Something that has hit us very hard. I am empathetic for others in the market where this income stream probably featured a little bit more strongly.
Sure.
But I think one of the realities is that it does present policy and regulatory uncertainty. So how long will this suspension take place? What will it look like if it does reemerge? And anytime there's any uncertainty in a market, that is always going to scare a few investors. So we're hoping that there's some good clarity and certainty over the coming weeks and months around what this is going to look like moving forward.
Sure. I think that's one of the big factors is just how quickly there is a resolution. I'm sure there'll be an appeal. I would have thought by some of those who are set to benefit or who have already benefited from the capacity market. But how quickly that is seen through the courts, I guess, is a question. And as you say, the uncertainty is always a prohibitor to further investment. In terms of from projects that you're involved with, you mentioned obviously that it's a relatively small part of many people's revenue streams or stacking. But are you directly affected, or others that you know directly affected by the situation presently?
For us, not necessarily. We have just gone out. We're kind of live in the market as we speak, raising the first 250 million required for our first 10 projects, 2 of which will connect in October of next year, and the next 8 in 2020. It really, as I mentioned, it was kind of the sub 5% of the stack, more than that, depending upon if we would take a taker, price maker approach to the capacity market strategy. But so it hasn't really hit us strongly at all. But I do know others in the market, especially those that are kind of involved in gas peaking plants, where that has really taken a pretty big hit to their pipeline and the investability of the projects they're working on. So I think that's proving to be a real struggle for them. But throughout the storage industry over the last few days, speaking to colleagues that are focused on the market, it's not hitting them aggressively, and actually it is some of that validation in terms of that flexible low carbon asset class, which is battery storage. So I think overall we are seeing it as an optimistic, positive outcome.
Sure. Yeah, I had similar message from one or two others I've spoken to in the sector just in the last 24 hours or so. Even though I say I was blindsided a little bit by the announcement when it came through. Policy is something you and I have talked about quite a lot over the years. I was intrigued last week, back end of last week, to see that UK Energy Minister Greg Clark announcing rather gloriously the end of the energy trilemma. Clearly, the trilemma of decarbonising at a cost-effective way whilst maintaining security of supply. Talking about the benefit of renewables clearly in that mix. It's only about 18 months ago I was at a meeting and spoke directly to Greg Clark and tried to talk to him about onshore wind and solar, and was given a very, very shall we say, straight bat, and the conversation was not entertained. You've obviously been active in the UK energy sector for some time. Did you see that announcement, and did you have any particular sort of thoughts on if there's a disconnect between those words and what's the reality on the ground?
I appreciated the view. It makes sound right. I don't say that in a condescending, patronizing way, but there is still a lot of work to be done. Far from, job done. I'm picturing my former President Bush standing on a large ship looking at, job done. There's still a ton of work to be done. And I think there are some positive indications that we're moving in the right direction. Kind of costs and scale economics and learning curves across the whole sector, wind, solar, storage, are continuing to come down, which is great, and it is providing that kind of cost-effective, opportunity. But I think it does require kind of us as the industry, the coalface, no pun intended, in terms of finding more resilient, more creative revenue streams. For us downstream, we see that in what we're looking to do on the EV charging side. You see that in kind of private wire, PPA offtakes, where you can get, solid bankable offtaker to help provide some of that long-term revenue certainty. So I think that there really is a requirement that we as an industry need to start to continue to innovate and thinking outside the box on some of these things. I'd love to see on the behind the meter opportunity, behind the meter storage, how can we look at business continuity and reduction of insurance risks and how that could flow through as an income stream. I'm sure there's many other ideas out there that we can start thinking about. But yeah, it's a move in the right direction. I think we need to celebrate kind of some of these milestones. I heard the Energy Minister, Claire Perry, speak a few weeks ago about, this kind of climate optimism, and that we do need to celebrate some of the successes that we've had in the UK. While kind of those on the inside, it has seemed very volatile, and it's had its ups and downs with a few feed-in tariff cuts. There really has, there's a lot to be proud of. This has been a very innovative policy market that has stimulated an industry to allow it to kind of kick off. I think it's now, our job as an industry to really kind of take it to the next level. And so I think that's a good challenge. And, again, I think a good kind of call to action. Well, maybe a little bit too early to say that job done.
Yeah.
I think it's we're getting there. We're getting there.
Okay. I guess I'm quite skeptical, having been in the sector since 2007, and clearly in that time, huge growth and huge opportunities in wind, in solar, of course. So we've gone from sort of measuring in megawatts during that time to I think we're at about 13, 14 gigawatts now in the UK. So you have to, as you say, celebrate those successes. But it always feels a little to me like there's one step forward, two back sometimes in policy. We have a lot of announcements. It seems much more positively around energy storage, batteries, and e-mobility, but still solar and wind, onshore wind in particular, seem to still have it quite tough in the UK. to my mind, to really address the energy mix and to address that trilemma Greg spoke about. We really need to boost those technologies. Do you feel more optimistic than me in terms of the policy regime? I guess you're a little bit closer to, if as you put it, the coalface these days than I am. Do you feel there's a willingness in government from your engagement to finally see renewables as a cost-effective solution and not to focus on the intermittency and the potential problems?
Yeah, I do, and I think that there's some good examples. While not necessarily on the generation side, I think what we've seen on some of the declarations on the intention to ban the sale of vehicles by 2040, that call to bring that back to 2032, kind of.
Hey Matt, we seem to have lost you there. Hi Matt, sorry, we seem to have lost you there just around the 2030 diesel car or ICE car situation. If you can pick back up from there.
Sure. Well, so I was just saying that while that's not on the renewables generation side, I think that is some of the kind of low carbon policy kind of scene settings and commitments that we need to see, and having those strong declarations. And I think that bringing putting those flags in the ground in terms of what we need to achieve over a defined period of time, if there's going to be the policy backdrop to support that, is absolutely required. From a wind standpoint, we have the luxury of 80% of Europe's wind kind of blowing through UK shores, and we need to make sure that that's a fantastic gift that we're given, and we need to make sure that we can capture all that. So sure. I think we've seen the offshore wind industry really take off. I think we'll start to see a bit of more of an emergence of solar. I'm hoping that a lot more of that is going to be deployed on a rooftop type scenario. But yeah, the mix, the renewables mix needs to continue to grow its footprint, and I definitely do think that is going to be the case, especially when economics and costs take over. It is kind of hard to refute that. You could be the biggest climate denier you want, but you can't really argue with sheer economics.
Sure, yeah, and I think that's actually saying we've seen dramatic falls, particularly in solar, but also in wind and of course storage in the last few years, which does start to get to a point of being undeniable. Looking at the policy backdrops, we picked up on a story also going back to your homeland of California, where they've just announced that PG&E are looking to retire 3 gas plants and replace with a fairly substantial storage capacity. I think it's 567 megawatts or 2,270 megawatt hours of storage. The headline that caught my eye was that the cost of the battery is cheaper than continuing to operate the plants as they are. Again, we've seen great things in California for a number of reasons, but the scale of battery storage solutions, something which that you see as favorable, and does scale really help from a deployment point of view?
Yeah, it does, and I think that caught my eye. I was absolutely very pleased to see some of these types of numbers, coming out in the headlines. And if we're talking about infrastructure, we need to be talking about hundreds of megawatts, if not gigawatts. We need to talk about, billions and not millions. And these are, the types of conversations that are starting to take place. These are the types of pipelines that are starting to build. Needless to say, from a cost standpoint, and whether that's the capex of, procuring batteries, or the overheads and kind of the opex of running those assets over time, when those are done in scale, you're going to see cost competitive advantages in the upfront costs and the ongoing costs as well. So it's not surprising. I think we've continued to see cost declines over the last 3-4 years that we've been in the battery space. And I think those will continue, probably not as dramatically as we've seen the last couple years. But there's some, pressures from the EV market as we're competing, the stationary storage competing for the same battery assets. There we're seeing. So I think that, yeah, these are the kind of ambitions, and these are the case studies and the stories that we need to be talking about. I think the flexibility, we need flexibility in the system. We always talk about battery storage as a flexible asset on top of a flexible asset class. And so it has the ability to perform. We've seen that, with the 50 megawatt project in Australia, its ability to essentially put its foot down on the floor and really accelerate and respond in an event where a coal-fired power station, trips. And so these are great examples of batteries' ability to compete and have more inherent flexibility and be able to perform more services faster than a lot of other technologies. So it'll be very interesting to see how the California market continues to evolve, and that's absolutely welcome to see. And yes, very nice, considering I'm from California as well. So I look forward to going home and visiting some of these beasts.
Yeah, it would be good to do so. I mean, you mentioned also Australia, where again, the Tesla in particular of those headline projects, and again, I did see that there were one or two new, larger scale projects in Australia that were at least mooted, if not signed off so far. Great case studies, as you say. But do you see, or how quickly perhaps do you see projects of that scale rolling into the UK and or sort of Europe? Obviously, both the market dynamics and of course the sort of the environmental situations are different. But do you see that projects of that size and scale are within the short-term view for Europe?
For the UK, I can't speak across Europe. I mean, we've started looking into other markets, but good God, we have enough on our plate right now to keep us busy. I think when you start looking at what the pipeline of interconnectors and how that's going to feature moving forward, when you look at what will this kind of macro impact of post Brexit world, and that question around security of supply and so on, I think that storage provides a fantastic capability to really address some of those big issues. We've relied on a very large, substantial battery asset in the form of De Norwig as a pumped hydro.
Yeah.
Okay. And I think we're looking at, we always talk about our pipeline as a distributed lithium De Norwig, which sounds like a very dangerous body of water to go swimming in. But I think it has a lot of the same features. It doesn't have the length and kind of the depth of dispatch, but its response can be faster. Its cost per cycle can be more attractive. The fact that it's distributed in nature, I was kind of talking about, we're moving into a distributed, decentralized generation pool, and it only makes sense that we move to a distributed, balancing flexibility pool as well. So in short, yes, I definitely see the timing is now. We saw, last year, the build out, this year and last year, the build out of the EFR project, which is great to see. And I think that really set the tone and provided that investor confidence that this technology can respond, it's investable, and will perform the services that are required, but will also have the ability to kind of pivot over time. It doesn't have that beauty of a long-term 20, 25-year government subsidy, but where it does have some elements of secured income streams, even for a shorter period of contract, that can definitely help get projects away. And but it does come down to investor confidence that there will be a strategy in place, and that's where I think the role of a very good, solid, strategic-minded asset manager that has the ability to pivot these assets over time to make sure that they're realizing value, they're providing the services required for the system, and if that is the case, they will be financially rewarded appropriately. So yeah, I think the time, I feel like the whole industry has been saying this for a number of years now, but I think the time genuinely is right, and we see some very solid pipelines that have been built. and quite a few of them. This is where we're focusing on the kind of transmission side of all of this, but a lot of those on the distribution network are struggling to get away. But I think that you'll start to see more and more of those kind of over the coming years start to trickle into the market as well.
Sure. Okay. You touched on their sort of costs. I mean, I appreciate you're a developer rather than a sort of a battery supplier. We work with a number at Hyperion, including LG Chem, one of the largest. Did you see? And again, I think we touched on last week's podcast, BNEF, former employer of yours, talking about a 1.2 trillion investment by 2030, I think it was, in terms of in the battery segment. Do you see anything in terms of either technological leaps or cost leaps or energy density leaps that are impacting on your sort of future planning and some of the projects that you're looking at the moment, or do you see a sort of a more steady, sort of a less of a decline as you suggested before?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we have, it's one of the words I absolutely despise, but I will say it. We are agnostic in terms of suppliers. We're agnostic in terms of technologies, to be totally honest.
Yeah.
We want to leverage the existing infrastructure that's in the market, taking excess capacity from the transmission network and optimize that as much as we can. We're focused right now, one, on lithium ion and two, on 1 hour systems. But over time, and whether that's in the repowering of some of these assets 7, 8, 9 years on, we may look to elongate the duration of those batteries, but we also may look, some of our projects that we'll build out in 2, 3, 4 years, those may be 90-minute systems, 2-hour systems. So I think that what that comes down to, though, is kind of what does the system need? And then subsequently kind of the economics of providing that service. So right now we see 1 hour systems stacking up. I mentioned that costs have been on the decline very, very dramatically over the last 3 or 4 years, stabilizing quite a bit right now. And that's another kind of part of the backdrop. We've heard for a long time the narrative of, well, the time's not right. Costs are going to come down. Yeah. But I think that kind of learning curve and that stabilization point that we've seen in so many other sectors, wind, solar, is really starting to kind of plateau a bit. So in terms of the $1.2 trillion going to the market, those are the kind of numbers we need to be talking about, because that is the amount of kind of displacement opportunity that exists in the market. So if storage is going to be a big part of the solution, then those are the kind of numbers we need to start referencing and using. Sure.
Okay, cool. So in terms of pivot, again, lots of headlines lately. I think just a couple of days ago, Liam Fox was announcing a $5 billion in sort of dollar UK investment, obviously citing a number of projects, but Pivot Power and what you're up to was cited within that. And I think numbers in excess of $1 billion. More short term, I know you've already sort of talked. I've seen some headlines around the projects in Carlisle and Norwich, I think it is. Before we move on to those, are we allowed to talk about the football stadium project, or is that still embargoed?
The end of next week we will. Okay. So I'll pause on that. We just have a few things that are being signed off as we speak, but more on that very soon.
Cool. Okay, so in terms of Pivot Power and the plans for this rollout of large-scale battery storage projects linked to obviously EV charging capabilities, are you able to share a little bit more around the plans? What are any of the sort of the business models and some of the challenges that you're facing at the present time, and of course the upside of things actually being deployed?
Yeah, sure. So I kind of tend to use the language of the industry that we're trying to politely disrupt, that being oil and gas. So we're very much focused on the upstream side of this. So large transmission connected batteries at 50 megawatts, 49.9 from a planning standpoint, that are hosted adjacent to national grid substations dotted throughout the country. There are 45 of these strategic sites that we've selected. So we're focused, on the battery component, and in terms of the investment that we're raising right now, we need to articulate and make it absolutely crystal clear around the investability in that battery and for its ability to perform in the markets. A majority of that income will come from trading and arbitrage markets, essentially filling up during cheap times and dispatching using during more expensive times.
Okay.
Additional pieces to the stack, balancing mechanism, capacity market, depending on how that reemerges. Some ancillary services as well. So those are kind of really the key pieces. The kind of midstream, which is essentially that cable running from substation into the electrification of a local market. We're advancing on those opportunities. You mentioned Carlisle and Norwich. Those are two of our three sites that have come through planning. We've also had Southampton receive its planning consent as well. So buses, taxis, and corporate fleets, absolutely low-hanging fruit, high utilization rates, very predictable, and so on. But we do need to focus on general public charging as well. So we are working with other partners, more downstream EV charging business models of many shapes and sizes that we will work with to be able to provide that ample power that we can scale over time. In terms of that investability and what that stack looks like, in year one, it will be very, very minimal in terms of the EV offtake, power offtake. In year two, it will be a little bit more than year one. In year three, a little bit more than year two. And we'll start to see that really ramping up. By year 10, it's tough to say, but I think that starts to become a really, really, really interesting feature and a very nice revenue stream that can sit alongside. Oh, sorry about that.
Okay, I think we've got up to the revenue stream, which is sitting alongside others.
So sitting alongside others in the market, and so I think that we really want to make sure we're doing everything we can to accelerate the whole market and move it forward. There are some challenges that we cannot control, such as the length of time it takes you to actually purchase and get your hands on an electric vehicle.
Sure.
But those are things that more or less are out of our control. So it's been, as I mentioned, we've kicked off investor meetings. Things are going well so far, a very solid response. And we will be looking to close on that first 250 million of equity that we're raising right now by kind of mid to back end of Q1 of next year.
Okay, cool. So again, from those projects, primarily they are battery storage projects. And again, we talked about, I guess, the impact of the certainly huge levels of interest in e-mobility. You're quite right. I recently tried to buy a full EV at iPace in particular, but it was a real struggle. The lead times are phenomenal, so I had to revert back to a hybrid. But sort of the huge levels of interest in e-mobility, the benefits, I guess, on one hand of driving costs down that brings to the battery storage market, but also I think you touched on before the challenges of again sort of supply, I guess, constraints if the EV market takes off as we expect. But has the huge levels of interest and noise around e-mobility been beneficial to the storage projects? Has it been? Would any of these have happened if e-mobility wasn't at the stage it's at the moment?
It's a good question. I think that we have people calling the office asking if we can install a charger at their house. I politely have to let them know that we don't do that. People asking which EV they should buy. I don't have the answer to that. We don't sell vehicles either. But I think it is the thing that from a general public standpoint is very interesting. Now, from an investability standpoint, it's intriguing, and it's real. It's absolutely a fantastic fundamental part of why we're doing what we're doing. But it really, for these projects to be funded and get off the ground, there needs to be a very, very clear business plan around its kind of foundational income stream, and that's around the trading and the arbitrage and ancillary services and so on. So yes, it's created interest, which is never a bad thing. But I think for us, it's really about making sure that we're focused on everything that we can do to get each of these projects away. So that's everything from advancing the pipeline, securing lease options for the battery site, securing planning permission for the battery site, doing everything that is battery related before we really start ramping up our activities kind of downstream on the EV side.
Sure.
We are focused and we have kicked off those activities. We are looking at securing land rights on strategic areas, near motorway service areas, population densities, and so on.
Yeah.
But that always needs to play kind of second fiddle, if you will, to the battery side. Because if the battery piece doesn't get away, the EV side, we can't deliver on our promises there. Sure.
Okay. And from Southampton, Carlisle, Norwich, which is likely to be on the ground first? That's a reference site and something tangible that people can look at and see in situ.
So Southampton and Carlisle are our first. Those will both connect in October of 2019. So those are our first two connection dates that have been offered by National Grid. We will have an additional 8, including Norwich, connecting in Q1 and then some in Q4 of 2020. So an additional 8 sites there. So that'll be 500 megawatts deployed across 2019 and 2020. We'll then continue at a similar pace across 2021, 2022, 23. But yes, it's those first 2 in Southampton and Carlisle next year, which works out well. It wasn't by design, I'll be totally honest, in terms of our northernmost site and one of our more southern sites.
Yeah.
We are not, I need to be very clear, while our numbers are big, we are not going to electrify the whole country. There needs to be a lot of other business models and other people coming into this market to really drive momentum and pace. We're looking to move the needle a bit, and that's we're pleased with how things are going. But it starts with those first 2, and those will be fantastic projects. Could not be more excited about that. There's a video that we've just put live on our website, which you can check out, which gives you a little bit more of a visual interpretation. We had some drones go down to Southampton and really show what that site's going to look like. So yeah, it's all becoming quite real, which is fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll share some links on the website for the podcast so that people can check out those that video and other details. Cool. So as you say, really exciting. It's really good to see that things are, looking at moving along now to a proper deployment here in the UK. One question, one of my passions, Cleantech aside or within Cleantech, is how businesses scale. Obviously, not specifically just putting my recruitment hat on, but just looking at how businesses scale, how Cleantech businesses scale in all sort of ways. What do you foresee as being some of the challenges of getting from where you are now to hopefully where you'll be in 5 years' time as the business scales? What are the sort of things that I won't necessarily keep you awake at night, but are your key focus areas?
Yeah, it's a good question, which evolves on a day-to-day basis. There is, as you know, starting your own business and kind of growing and scaling it, there is no roadmap. There isn't anybody holding your hand to tell you exactly how it's done. That's daunting at times. It's also very exciting at times. But it's everything from the niggly things like outgrowing our office and needing to find new office space.
Yeah.
Obviously, the talent piece is incredibly important. Really pleased with the team that we've built so far, but taking that to the next level and continuing to plug the gaps that we need, which absolutely essential. I think the thing that genuinely does keep me up at night. I mean, I have an absolute buzz when I walk in this office. I love the people that I work with. I'm incredibly fortunate to be around such talented, focused, hungry, committed people. How do we continue to bring and maintain that same culture? And it's relatively easy when you're the size that we are right now. But as we, treble over the course of the next kind of 3 to 6 months, that's something that I'm going to be absolutely laser focused on to make sure that continues, which is relatively easy for me considering I am not the technical wizard, as you know.
Yeah.
That is far from. I'm not an operational ninja. That is far from, and I have not raised this kind of money in my life. So I get to focus on the kind of cultural aspects of growing this team, but at the same time having fantastic talent that covers all the other key elements we need to be focusing on as well.
Sure. Well, from my point of view, that's the fun stuff. And again, clearly with an absolute bias in mind, but maintaining the culture, growing the culture with the core values that you have, I know because we've spoken many times, but to maintain those core values within an organization when you're scaling at a double, let alone a triple digit growth rate is a huge challenge. And I'm sure we'll offline have a chat around that. But for me, that's the fun stuff. I know Mikey and others will, let's just say, probably argue different with the technology, but I think it will be great to see the progress of Pivot Power and how these sites come to play and how you scale the business. Really appreciate the time, Matt, on this occasion. I'll just wrap up and say thank you very much for your time. I hope everybody at home or listening in has enjoyed the podcast and the discussions. As I say, it'd be great if you can support us by subscribing to iTunes or your podcast service of choice. Share review would be great. You can also share your feedback we have a LinkedIn group, a Twitter account, which is @WeekInCleantech, a Facebook page, and of course the website, thisweekincleantech.com. Next week, my guest is Dan Caesar, who's the brains and strategist behind the Fully Charged YouTube channel and Fully Charged Live event, which saw over 6,000 clean tech and e-mobility enthusiasts at Silverstone this July, which is obviously hosted by Robert Llewellyn and Johnny Smith. But Dan is the man that makes things happen behind the scenes. If you'd like to hear more from Matt Allen, and I'd recommend that you do so, you can contact him or see via LinkedIn, and of course the Pivot Power website with this video that Matt referred to at pivot-power.co.uk. I hope you tune in to next week. In the meantime, thank you very much, Matt, and good evening.
Thank you. Take care.